While my husband slid a 5-carat diamond onto my sister's finger at my own memorial, he had no idea I wasn't in that casket. I was standing in the shadows, watching them, and preparing to burn their world to the ground. My name is Sloane Sterling, and for most of my 32 years, I believed that the strength of a structure was determined by its blueprint. As the principal owner of Sterling Maritime, I had spent a decade building a global shipping empire that was supposed to be my daughter's legacy. I was a woman of logic, numbers, and ironclad contracts. I thought I had built a life that was unsinkable. I was wrong. I had ignored the termites in the foundation, and they were the people I shared my dinner table with. The betrayal didn't start with a scream. It started with a whisper and a cup of poison tea. It was a rainy Tuesday in October, when the dizzy spells began. I was overseeing the docking of our new fleet in Savannah when the horizon suddenly tilted. My husband, Damien Vane, a man with a smile like a summer morning and a heart like a winter grave, caught me before I hit the pavement. He was a struggling architect when I met him, a man I had rescued, much like the woman in the sources rescued her family. I gave him a seat at the board, a name that commanded respect, and a lifestyle he could never have designed for himself. "You're working too hard, Sloane," he'd whisper, his breath smelling of expensive bourbon and lies. "Let Vivienne handle the social gala. You need to rest. Let me take care of the signatures today." My younger sister, Vivienne Sterling, was the Rachel of my life. She was a woman who translated her lack of talent into a talent for victimhood. She lived in a penthouse I paid for, wore clothes she charged to my accounts, and spent her days curating a life of leisure while I spent 60 hours a week reviewing compliance documents and maritime laws. Our parents had passed away young, leaving me the responsibility of her survival. Like the sister in the sources who mocked the very generosity she relied on, Vivienne often joked to our social circle that I was too masculine and emotionally stunted because I preferred spreadsheets to parties. By December, my health had deteriorated to the point where the board of directors began to whisper. I was experiencing memory gaps, tremors in my hands, and a crushing fatigue. Damien was always there, a devoted shadow, presenting me with documents to sign. Documents he claimed were for routine maintenance, but were actually the first bricks in my tomb. He was forging a narrative of my mental instability, using my own professional license number and credentials to create a trail of errors that made me look incompetent. The night of the accident was supposed to be a celebration of Sterling Maritime's 20th anniversary. We were at our cliffside estate in Big Sur. I remember the smell of the salt air and the way the fog felt like a wet shroud. Damien had insisted I take a relaxing drive to clear my head before the guests arrived. He handed me a glass of water, the last thing I would drink as Sloane Sterling. I remember the steering wheel feeling like lead. I remember the headlights hitting the mist and the sudden realization that the brakes were unresponsive. As the car plummeted toward the jagged rocks of the Pacific, my last thought wasn't of my business or my wealth. It was of Vivienne's face earlier that afternoon, the way she had looked at Damien with a predatory hunger that was now unmistakable. I didn't die. The car hit a ledge, a structural anomaly that the ocean hadn't yet eroded. I was thrown from the vehicle before it hit the water. I woke up 3 days later in a remote clinic in Baja, discovered by a fisherman who didn't know my name or my net worth. My face was a map of scars, my ribs were shattered, and my memory was a fractured glass. But as the fog in my brain lifted, the same fog that had been induced by the neurotoxins Damien had been feeding me, the truth emerged. I spent 6 months in that clinic, watching the news on a flickering television. I watched my own funeral, a lavish, televised affair where Damien played the grieving widower with an Oscar-worthy performance. I watched him stand beside Vivienne, who wore a black veil that couldn't hide her triumph. They had used a missing person declaration and a forged death certificate to activate a clause in my grandfather's will that I never thought would be triggered: the immediate transfer of the Sterling estate to the surviving spouse and siblings in the event of an unwitnessed accidental death. Like the family in the sources who used the protagonist's identity to secure an $85,000 loan, Damien and Vivienne had gone much further. They had liquidated my private holdings, sold 3 of my ships to a shell company in the Cayman Islands, and were now planning to merge Sterling Maritime with a rival firm that I had fought for a decade to keep at bay. They weren't just stealing my money. They were erasing my life's work. I stayed dead. It was the only way to become a ghost. I sold the only thing I had left, a diamond necklace I had tucked into my jacket the night of the crash, and hired a man named Silas Blackwood. Silas was a disgraced private investigator, a man the industry called the grave digger because he was an expert at finding things that were meant to stay buried. He was the only person who believed that the Iron Lady of Sterling Shipping hadn't just accidentally driven off a cliff. "They've already replaced you, Sloane," Silas said, showing me photographs of the renovation at the Sterling Manor. "Damien is gutting the West Wing. Vivienne has moved into your master suite. They've even scheduled an engagement party for next month." It seems the widower didn't have to look far for comfort. The anger was a cold, architectural force. It rebuilt my shattered bones and sharpened my mind. I spent my days in a small apartment in San Diego, surrounded by Silas's surveillance footage and forensic accounting reports. We discovered the same pattern of fraud mentioned in the sources: forged signatures on business guarantees, the misuse of professional credentials, and a network of lies intended to make the victim look emotionally unstable. Damien had used my name to secure a $40 million credit line, claiming I had verbally authorized it before my passing. He was using the company's capital to fund a series of failing real estate developments in Dubai, projects that were nothing more than a way to launder money into his personal accounts. "They think you're a memory," Silas told me. "They've spent $18 million of your cash in 6 months. They're reckless because they think nobody is watching the books anymore." "I'm not just watching the books, Silas," I replied, staring at my reflection in the darkened window. I didn't recognize the woman staring back. My hair was shorter, my eyes were harder, and the scars on my cheek looked like a lightning bolt. "I'm the architect of their downfall. They built their new life on my credit and my identity. Now I'm going to call the debt." I didn't go to the police. Just as the woman in the sources knew that a simple fraud report wasn't enough to stop a family that viewed her as an investment, I knew that Damien had too many friends in the DA's office. I needed to destroy their reputation before I destroyed their freedom. I needed to wait for the moment when they were most visible, most arrogant, and most vulnerable. The engagement party was the perfect stage. It was being held at the Sterling Maritime Ballroom, the heart of my empire. All the board members, the investors, and the social elite would be there. They would be there to celebrate the merger of the century and the union of the 2 people who had murdered me for a signature. "How do you want to play this?" Silas asked. "I want them to see me," I said. "I want them to realize that a boundary isn't a speech. It's a decision. And I've decided that they are no longer authorized to use my name, my home, or my heir." I spent the final week before the gala orchestrating the notices. I contacted the maritime insurers, the offshore banks, and the SEC. I sent them the proof of the forged death certificate and the neurotoxin reports from the Mexican clinic. I didn't want them to just go to jail. I wanted them to feel the same vertigo I felt on that cliff, the moment when the floor falls away and you realize you are falling. As I dressed for the gala in a gown of midnight blue silk, the color of the water that should have killed me, I felt a strange sense of peace. I wasn't the fortunate sister anymore. I wasn't the rescue account for a failing husband. I was Sloane Sterling, and I was about to show them that necessity does not give you ownership of another person's identity. The music was playing as I arrived. I stood at the back of the ballroom, invisible in the crowd of people who had once called me a friend and then attended my funeral without a second thought. I saw Damien on the stage, looking triumphant. I saw Vivienne, wearing my mother's pearls and my husband's ring. "Ladies and gentlemen," Damien's voice boomed over the speakers, "tonight we celebrate a new chapter for the Vane and Sterling legacy. a chapter built on strength and the memory of the woman who started it all. "The memory is over, Damien," I said, stepping into the light. The room didn't just go silent. It froze. The collective intake of breath sounded like a gale force wind. Damien's champagne glass shattered on the stage, the liquid spraying over Vivienne's white dress like a sacrificial offering. She screamed, a thin, jagged sound that reminded me of the seagulls at the cliff. I walked toward the stage, my heels clicking against the marble like a death march. Every phone in the room began to ring. The board members, the creditors, the press, they were all receiving the same notification. Sloane Sterling is alive. The merger is a fraud. The Vane accounts are frozen. You're dead," Vivienne stammered, her face turning the color of ash. I said, reaching the foot of the dais. "But it turns out I'm a very expensive ghost to keep buried. And I've come to collect the interest on everything you stole." The silence of the room was broken by the sound of the ballroom doors being kicked open. It wasn't my security. It was the federal agents I had alerted 3 days ago. This was only the first 15 minutes. They had taken a year of my life. I wasn't going to give them another second of my mercy. The silence that followed my entrance into the Sterling Maritime Ballroom wasn't just the absence of sound. It was the weight of 100 reputations hanging by a thread. I stood on the dais, the flickering light of the crystal chandeliers reflecting off my silver-scarred cheek, watching as the federal agents moved with the cold precision of a demolition crew. Damien's face had transitioned from the ashen gray of shock to a frantic, sweating desperation. Vivienne, meanwhile, was clutching my mother's pearls so tightly they threatened to snap, her eyes darting toward the exits as if she could simply filter herself out of this reality. "Sloane, this is a misunderstanding," Damien stammered, stepping toward me with his hands raised, still trying to project the image of the concerned husband. "You've been through a trauma. You're confused. The accident. The accident was a failed execution, Damien." I interrupted, my voice amplified by the microphone he had just used to toast my memory. "And I am not confused. I am the owner of every ship, every ledger, and every debt you've tried to bury under my name." As the agents led them out in handcuffs, Vivienne screaming about harassment and Damien demanding to call his lawyers, I didn't feel the rush of victory I had expected. Instead, I felt the cold, hard clarity of the coastal infrastructure compliance specialist I had always been. I knew that their arrest was only the first phase of a massive structural repair. Just like the woman in the sources whose family believed they knew exactly what she was worth based on their own greed, Damien and Vivienne had underestimated the one thing I possessed: documentation. The next morning, I arrived at Sterling Maritime headquarters. I didn't enter through the executive lobby. I walked through the side entrance, flanked by Silas Blackwood and my new lead counsel, Balthazar Grimm. Balthazar was a man who didn't argue with emotions. He argued with forensic evidence. As we reached the top floor, I found the door to my private office had been replaced with a glass panel etched with Vivienne's name. Inside, the room where I had built a billion-dollar empire had been converted into a lifestyle recording studio. Ring lights, plush velvet sofas, and shelves of expensive social media equipment sat where my drafting tables used to be. Vivienne had been filming grief vlogs in my office, using my professional backdrop to sell the image of a sensitive sister struggling to keep the family legacy alive while spending my money on Miami trips and luxury content. "Cleared out," I told Silas. "Every camera, every piece of furniture she bought with my credit. It's all evidence of the fraud now." Balthazar Grimm sat at the conference table, spreading out the documents Silas had recovered from the company's internal server. "It's deeper than identity theft, Sloane," Balthazar said, his voice a low rumble. "While you were dead, Damien didn't just steal your cash. He listed you as an unpaid compliance officer on every insurance renewal for the fleet. By keeping your professional license number active on the company records, he secured a preferred risk classification, saving the firm millions in premiums while he was secretly gutting its assets. I felt a surge of cold fury. For years, Damien had mocked my work as meaningless bureaucracy and unnecessary rules, yet he had secretly used my credibility and my professional record to make his failing business look stable to the insurers. He believed that necessity gave him ownership of my identity, using my credentials to authorize safety certifications for ships that hadn't seen a dry dock in years. He also submitted a new application for a $40 million credit line just 3 days before your accident, Balthazar continued, pointing to a digital signature that was a terrifyingly accurate copy of mine. Vivienne's email was listed as the recovery address, and your personal driver's license was uploaded from her phone. They didn't just want you gone. They wanted your life to continue acting as their personal A-team. I spent the next 48 hours in a marathon of legal revocations. I revoked every guarantee connected to the Vane real estate projects, frozen Vivienne's apartment accounts, and terminated the digital promotion contract Damien had set up to funnel $12,000 a month into Vivienne's new media company, a company that had no clients, no employees, and had produced nothing but 3 photographs of boats. The blowback was immediate. By Tuesday morning, the family narrative had shifted. Just as the sister in the sources uploaded a tearful video claiming she was being controlled by money, Vivienne managed to leak a recording from jail. She claimed that I was jealous and emotionally unstable, and that I was destroying the family because she had made an innocent joke at the gala. Relatives I hadn't spoken to in years began calling, accusing me of humiliating my husband on what was supposed to be a night of celebration. They're trying to turn the consequence of their fraud into a personal attack on your character, Silas warned as we watched a news segment where an aunt claimed I was risking the jobs of hundreds of employees by freezing the accounts. I'm not risking the jobs, I replied. Their decisions risk the jobs. I'm just the one who stopped funding the denial. I arranged a preliminary meeting with Damien's legal team at a neutral location, a sterile conference room near the harbor. I arrived with Balthazar Grimm, and for the first time since my death, I sat across from the man I had once loved. Damien looked haggard, but he still tried to use the old tools of manipulation. He leaned across the table, his voice low and pleading. "Sloane, we can fix this," he said, pushing a folder toward me. "The bank has agreed to withdraw the fraud report if you just sign a clarification stating that you verbally agreed to advise the company and support the loan. It was a family misunderstanding, Sloane. You know how business is. Sometimes you have to move faster than the paperwork. An apology requiring me to sign a lie is just another transaction, Damien," I said, repeating a hard-won truth I had learned from watching my own funeral. "You forged my name. You used my license. You told our daughter I had abandoned her because I was broken. I did what I had to do to save the company." Damien snapped, his composure finally breaking. "You were always so obsessed with your rules and your compliance. You think one government-regulated job makes you better than us." "No," I said, leaning in. "I think asking permission before using someone's identity makes me different." Damien's lawyer tried to argue that the $40 million loan was for inventory and company stability, but I placed 3 printed pages on the table, the same evidence Silas had uncovered. The first was an email from Vivienne to Damien. "Use Sloane's old signature file. She'll complain, but she always gives in once I start crying." The second was a message from Damien to a shell company in Dubai, discussing how to move the loan proceeds into his private accounts before the merger was finalized. The third was the receipt for the neurotoxin he had purchased through a research front. Their faces changed one by one as they realized that the Iron Lady had been documenting their every move while they were busy playing with her furniture. Vivienne, who had been brought in for the meeting under guard, began to cry, claiming that I was planning the scene to get revenge. "Revenge would be lying about you," I told her. "Revenge would be using your identity and laughing while you tried to save your home. This is just documentation." I presented them with a settlement prepared by Balthazar Grimm. I would not seek personal financial damages from the extended family, but Damien had to admit in writing that I had never authorized the loans or the compliance status. Vivienne had to publish a correction on her social media platforms, admitting that she had used my credit to fund a lifestyle she couldn't support. Most importantly, they had to move out of the Sterling estate and have no contact with me or my daughter for 3 years, communicating only through a designated legal email. "This makes us look guilty," Vivienne shouted. "You are guilty," I replied. "They didn't sign that night." As I walked to my car, Vivienne ran toward the glass partition, shouting, "Did you ever love me, Sloane?" It was the ultimate weapon of the manipulator, the attempt to return the victim to their old role of the abandoned protector. I looked at her, and for the first time, I didn't feel the need to rescue her. "I loved you every time I rescued you," I said, my voice echoing in the parking garage. "But you only felt loved when the rescue had a dollar amount." I drove away, leaving them to face the reality they had spent a year trying to avoid. By midnight, I had 43 missed calls from relatives, but for the first time, the silence didn't feel like abandonment. It felt like oxygen. I realized that I had spent my entire career reviewing safety documentation for flood control, yet I had never built a boundary to protect myself from the people who were supposed to be my harbor. By morning, the truth began to circulate. The insurer suspended the company's preferred rate, and the lender began a formal investigation into the Dubai accounts. Damien was no longer the visionary widower. He was a man whose company was built on hidden debt and a stolen signature. As I stood on the balcony of my office, watching the ships in the harbor move according to the rules I had spent my life defending, I realized that the accidental death Damien had planned for me had actually succeeded. The woman who allowed herself to be used, the woman who funded their denial, was dead. The woman who stood there now was Sloane Sterling, and she was finally, dangerously, free. But the legal battle was only starting. The courtroom was the next stage, and I was going to ensure that every bill they had forwarded to me for a decade was returned to its rightful owner. The morning after the gala felt like the world had been stripped of its color, leaving only the cold, hard lines of a structural blueprint. I stood in my office at Sterling Maritime, watching the sun rise over the harbor. The federal investigation was moving, but the war was shifting from the courtroom to the court of public opinion. Just as the family and the sources began a campaign of character assassination, once the money stopped, Damien and Vivienne were already pivoting from shock to a calculated, toxic defense. By 8 a.m., my phone began to vibrate with notifications from Sterling Social, the media platform Vivienne had built using my credit. She had uploaded a video titled "The Jealous Sister," the truth behind Sloane's return. In it, she sat in a dimly lit room, her eyes red from tears that looked remarkably like they had been applied with a dropper. She claimed that I had staged my disappearance as a psychological game and that my return was a calculated strike to ruin a family that had spent a year grieving for me. She spoke about my history of mental instability, using the very symptoms caused by the neurotoxins Damien had fed me as proof that I was unfit to lead. "Sloane has always needed to feel important," she whispered into the camera, echoing the father in the source. "She couldn't stand that the company was thriving without her. She wants to punish us for moving on. She's using money to control the people who love her most." I watched the view count climb. In the digital age, a lie travels around the world before the truth can even find its shoes. People I had known for 20 years began to comment, calling me cruel and vindictive. They didn't see the forged death certificate. They saw a grieving sister being bullied by an empire-building CEO. I remembered the lesson from the source. People call you cruel when your boundaries make their behavior inconvenient. "Don't read it, Sloane," Silas Blackwood said, walking into my office with a stack of forensic reports. "Lies are entertaining, while corrections feel like paperwork." "I need to know what they're building, Silas," I replied. "You can't fix a leak if you don't know which pipe is burst." The leak became a flood 2 hours later when a woman I hadn't seen in years appeared at the front desk. Cordelia Vane, Damien's mother, had flown in from her estate in the Carolinas. She didn't come to apologize. She came to the heart of my empire to perform the same workplace sabotage described in the sources. I watched the security monitors as Cordelia stood in the lobby, shouting for all my employees to hear. "Sloane is emotionally unstable," she cried, grabbing the arm of a young logistics clerk. "She's had a breakdown. She's endangering your jobs because of a family spat. Ask her about the doctors in Mexico. Ask her why she's trying to destroy her own husband." Security eventually escorted her away, but the damage was a precise cut to the company's morale. My employees looked at me with a mixture of fear and doubt. I realized then that Damien wasn't just trying to stay out of jail. He was trying to provoke me into a reaction that would prove their unstable narrative was true. He wanted footage of me losing control to use as collateral in the upcoming bail hearing. "I won't give them the footage, Silas," I said, my voice cold as the harbor water. "I'm not a rescue account anymore. I'm a protected person." We spent the afternoon reviewing the documents Silas had recovered from the company's shadow server. Just as the source protagonist discovered her father had listed her as an unpaid compliance officer to lower insurance rates, we found that Damien had done something even more dangerous. He had registered my professional maritime engineering license as the primary safety inspector for a fleet of aging tankers we had been planning to decommission. By keeping my credentials active while I was dead, he had bypassed 3 mandatory Coast Guard audits. He had signed my name to safety certifications for hulls that were rusting through, effectively making me the legal shield for any environmental disaster that might occur. He used my identity as collateral for a catastrophe, I whispered, the weight of the betrayal hitting me in the chest. He didn't just steal my money. He stole my integrity. "He believed necessity gave him ownership of your identity," Silas noted, echoing the cold logic of the father in the source. "To him, your career was just a tool he could use when his own business failed an insurance review." I called a meeting with the board of directors. They sat around the mahogany table, looking at me with the same resentment for making their dependence visible that Claire Whitmore's family felt. They had enjoyed the dividends Damien had paid them from the fraudulent loans, and now that I was back to stop the money, they viewed me as the villain of the story. "We've received a letter from Damien's counsel," one board member said, avoiding my eyes. "He claims that if we don't clarify the loan authorizations, the lender will freeze all supplier credit. 900 employees could lose their livelihoods. Sloane, is your pride worth their jobs?" It was the ultimate manipulation, the same one the father in the source used when he accused his daughter of destroying his business by refusing to fund his fraud. They wanted me to sign a lie to protect the family, ignoring the fact that the damage had been done the moment the fraud was committed. "I didn't submit the false documents," I told the board, my voice echoing the sharp clarity of the source protagonist. "Damien did. He bought a luxury boat and funded Vivienne's lifestyle while asking me to help cover payroll through a forged signature. I am revoking every guarantee connected to the Vane projects," I continued, placing a stack of legal notices on the table. "Every account, every insurance bond, and every emergency fund I have ever signed. If the company struggles, it is because it was built on hidden debt and stolen signatures, not because I refuse to continue the lie." The boardroom erupted. They called me selfish, jealous, and confused. They suggested I see a neutral family counselor, who I knew would be a friend of Cordelia Vane, much like the unlicensed counselor in the source. I listened for a minute, then I did the only thing that works when a boundary is being attacked. I walked out. As I crossed the parking lot with Silas, I saw Damien's car idling near the gate. He stepped out, looking like a man who was drowning and trying to take the rescue boat down with him. "Sloane, wait," he shouted. "Cordelia is right. You're not thinking clearly. This revenge is going to cost everyone everything. Is this what you want your life to look like? Organized around a lawsuit?" I stopped and looked at him. For years, I had organized my life around his anticipated emergencies. I had postponed my own dreams, my own car repairs, and my own vacations because his business needed me. I had become so skilled at rescuing him that I had never built a life that required my own courage. "I'm not seeking revenge, Damien," I said, repeating the words that had become my mantra. "Revenge would be using your identity and laughing while you tried to save your home. This is just documentation. You think you're better than us because of your boring career and your rules?" he hissed, his face reddening just like the fathers in the source. "No," I replied, opening my car door. "I think asking permission before using someone's identity makes me different." I drove home to the estate I had finally reclaimed. The silence of the house didn't feel like abandonment. It felt like oxygen. I sat in the library and realized that for the first time in 10 years, nobody was shouting my name or demanding a solution for their avoidance. I had been a silent insurance policy for a family that didn't even value who I was, only what I provided. That evening, Silas sent me a final piece of evidence. It was a screenshot from Vivienne's private group chat, recovered from a cloud backup. In it, she was joking with Damien just days before my accident. "Vivienne, Sloane will complain about the loan, but she always gives in once I start crying. Damien, don't tell her until the credit is approved. She worries too much when she sees numbers." The final proof was a marketing invoice from Vivienne's company for $12,000, money Damien had intended to transfer to her from the fraudulent maritime loan. She had been filming content, while our father's legacy was being gutted for delinquent taxes and luxury trips. I looked at the silver-haired woman in the mirror. I wasn't the jealous sister. I was the person who had stopped being a solution for their avoidance. I had learned that a boundary is not a speech. It is a decision that remains after the crying begins. "The investigation isn't over, Silas," I said into the phone. "But the rescue is. Let the consequences belong to them." I turned off my phone. By morning, the creditors would arrive. The insurer would finalize the suspension of the preferred rate. Damien would have to sell the fishing boat he bought while crying about peril. Vivienne would have to face a landlord who no longer had a guarantor for her rent. The bad luck was gone. The bills had finally been returned to their rightful owners. I was no longer my family's emergency account. I was finally free. The silence of my reclaimed estate was shattered on a Thursday morning by a headline that felt like a physical blow. Vivienne, desperate and cornered, had pivoted from grieving sister to active saboteur. She had posted a viral video claiming that I had ignored a dire family medical emergency involving our aunt, a woman who, in reality, was perfectly healthy. The post was designed to make me look like a cold, vengeful monster who had lost all touch with humanity. "She's filming from the driveway of our childhood home," Silas Blackwood said, handing me a tablet. "She's telling your followers that you refuse to pay for a life-saving surgery. It's a total fabrication, but the internet doesn't wait for a biopsy report." The smear campaign didn't stop online. My mother-in-law, Cordelia Vane, appeared at the Sterling Maritime headquarters for the second time. This time, she didn't just shout in the lobby. She managed to find her way to the executive floor, cornering several of my lead engineers. She told them I was emotionally unstable and that they should look for new jobs before my madness sank the fleet. Security eventually escorted her away, but the morale of the office was vibrating with uncertainty. I realized that my family wasn't just trying to regain control of the money. They were trying to dismantle my identity to prove that I needed them to manage my condition. "They want you to look cruel because your boundaries make their behavior inconvenient," Silas noted, echoing a bitter truth I was beginning to internalize. But the real battlefield was the deposition room. Balthazar Grimm, my attorney, had secured a court order for a preliminary testimony from Damien and Vivienne. I arrived at the sterile, glass-walled conference center wearing a suit of iron gray, my silver hair a sharp contrast against the dark wood of the table. Across from me sat Damien, looking like a man who had been caught in a landslide, and Vivienne, who was still trying to maintain her lifestyle creator persona by adjusting her lighting in the reflection of the glass. Balthazar began by laying out the forensic findings from the Sterling Maritime insurer. Mr. Vane, Balthazar began, his voice like cold iron, we have discovered that for the last 3 years, you listed Sloane Sterling as an unpaid compliance officer on every insurance renewal for the fleet. Why? Damien shifted in his chair, his eyes darting toward his legal team. It was a formality. Sloane always reviewed the safety procedures. I thought it was a way to honor her expertise. You didn't honor her expertise, Balthazar countered. You used her professional license number and her clean record to secure a preferred risk classification. This saved the firm millions in premiums, money you then diverted into your personal accounts. You secretly used her credibility to make your failing business look stable, all while mocking her work as meaningless bureaucracy in private emails. I watched Damien's face redden, the same shade of deep crimson my father used to get when his own frauds were uncovered. He believed that necessity gave him ownership of my identity, a belief that had allowed him to gamble with my career and my freedom. The deposition then turned toward the $40 million credit line. Balthazar placed a document on the table, the digital promotion contract, registered to Vivienne's new media company. Mr. Vane, according to these records, nearly $12,000 of the loan proceeds were assigned to Damien Sterling for online promotion of Sterling Maritime, Balthazar said. Can you explain what services were provided? Vivienne chimed in, her voice shrill. I'm a content creator. I posted about the brand. I was building this Sterling aesthetic. You posted 3 photographs of boats on an account with bot followers, Balthazar said, sliding a printout of her invoice across the table. This wasn't a marketing contract. It was a way for Damien to transfer borrowed money to you so you could fund your lifestyle, while the company owed back taxes. You spent the money on a trip to Miami, while Sloane was fighting for her life in a clinic you claimed she had abandoned her duties to attend. Vivienne's tears disappeared instantly, replaced by a sharp, calculating glare. She's the jealous sister, she hissed, pointing a manicured finger at me. She thinks her boring career makes her superior just because she has a license and a desk. She's trying to punish us for being happy. I leaned forward, looking at the sister I had rescued so many times that I had forgotten how to say no. I didn't submit the false documents, Vivienne. I didn't forge my own name or list myself as an unpaid officer in my husband's fraud. You chose to reject a life of stability because you preferred the lie of effortless success. The tension in the room snapped when Balthazar played a recording recovered from Vivienne's phone, a voice memo she had sent to Damien 3 days before my accident. Sloane will complain about the loan signature, but she always gives in once I start crying. Just make sure the credit is approved before she sees the numbers. The silence that followed was absolute. Damien looked at the floor, realizing that his own rescue boat was sinking. He tried to claim that I had verbally agreed to support the business, a desperate attempt to frame the fraud as a family misunderstanding. I never agreed to be your legal shield, Damien, I said, my voice steady. And I never agreed to let you use my identity as collateral for your catastrophes. You thought one maritime license made me an asset you could liquidate. You were wrong. I presented them with a settlement offer. Damien would admit in writing to the forgery and the unauthorized use of my credentials. Vivienne would be required to publish a full correction of her medical emergency, lies, and vacate the Sterling property within 48 hours. In exchange, I would cooperate truthfully with the federal investigation without requesting additional civil penalties against their extended family. This makes us look guilty, Vivienne shouted, the irony of her statement lost on no one. You are guilty, I replied. They didn't sign that day. Instead, they attempted one last act of sabotage. As I left the building, Damien followed me into the parking lot, his face twisted with a mixture of rage and fear. If you go through with this, the company will lose its preferred insurance classification, he warned, his voice a low growl. 900 employees will lose their jobs, Sloane. Is your pride worth their livelihoods? The employees are at risk because of your fraud, not my boundaries, I told him, mirroring the strength I had seen in the woman from the sources. I am not your family's emergency account anymore. I am a protected person. I drove away, leaving him standing in the shadows of the building he had tried to steal. That evening, I sat in my car and cried, not for the marriage I had lost, but for the years I had spent making myself smaller so everyone else could remain comfortable. I had become so skilled at rescuing them that I had never built a life that required my own courage. By the next morning, the medical emergency lie had been debunked by the aunt herself, who had posted her own video expressing confusion over Vivienne's claims. The board of directors, seeing the forensic evidence and the federal interest, voted to remove Damien from his interim position immediately. I returned to my office, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like the first honest day of my life. I had stopped trying to persuade my family that I was a good person. I had begun proving that I was a protected one. The bad luck woman was dead. The architect was back, and this time, the foundation was made of truth. The silence that followed didn't feel like abandonment anymore. It felt like oxygen. The final meeting took place in a private room of a restaurant overlooking the harbor, a place where the salt air usually felt like a beginning, but today it felt like an ending. I arrived with Silas Blackwood, while my attorney, Balthazar Grimm, waited in the main dining area, a silent sentinel for the justice we were about to finalize. Across the table, the Vane family looked like a structure after a controlled demolition. Damien had lost a visible amount of weight, his suits no longer fitting the man who had once tried to command the horizon. Vivienne, stripped of her designer labels and the lighting of her social media world, wore a plain sweater, her eyes red, not with grief, but with the exhaustion of a lie that had finally run out of oxygen. For the first 10 minutes, they didn't mention the $40 million fraud or the forged death certificate. They spoke in careful, polished phrases designed to test the waters of my mercy. Damien admitted that listing me as a compliance officer had been poor judgment, while Vivienne claimed her mocking videos were just a cruel joke, born from the stress of my disappearance. They used these soft words to replace the reality of their crimes: fraud, public humiliation, and harassment. "We want to end this legally and personally, Sloane," Damien said, placing a folder on the table. He explained that the lender had agreed not to pursue the criminal application if I confirmed the situation was a family misunderstanding. The document stated that I had expressed a general willingness to support the business and that he had reasonably interpreted it as permission to submit the loan. In exchange, they promised not to request financial assistance from me for 12 months. "So, you're offering to stop exploiting me for exactly 1 year?" I asked, the absurdity of the offer echoing the source where a family tried to trade a year of silence for a lifetime of theft. "Your husband could face criminal charges, Sloane," Vivienne whispered, her voice trembling. "Would you really let him go to jail after everything he did to help you build your name?" "I didn't submit false documents, Vivienne," I replied, my voice as steady as the iron hulls of my ships. "And I didn't forge my own name to fund a trip to Miami while my career was being used as collateral." I placed 3 printed pages on the table, the final nails in the coffin of their denial. The first was the recovered email, where Vivienne told Damien I would complain but eventually give in. The second was Damien's message about moving the loan proceeds to Dubai. The third was the receipt for the neurotoxins that had nearly ended my life. Their faces changed instantly, the apology evaporating as they realized I was no longer the rescue account they had trained to surrender. I presented my final settlement. I would not seek additional personal damages, but Damien had to admit in writing that I had never authorized the loan or served as a compliance officer. The company had to remove my name from every record, and they had to stop all contact with my workplace and my daughter for 2 years. Vivienne had to publish a full correction, admitting she had lied about the medical emergency and my character. "This is blackmail," Vivienne shouted, even as Balthazar Grimm entered the room to witness the final exchange. "This is documentation," I replied. "Revenge would be using your identity and laughing while you tried to save your home." This is just ensuring that the bills you've been forwarding to me for a decade are finally returned to their rightful owners." They signed that night, their pens scratching against the paper like the sound of a crumbling foundation. The investigation did not send Damien to prison only because the funds hadn't been fully released, but the written admission stayed on the company's permanent record, making it nearly impossible for him to ever secure a traditional loan again. Sterling Maritime survived, but not in the form he wanted. He had to close the expensive executive suites, move into a smaller warehouse, and operate according to the money the company actually earned. The fallout was a slow teacher for those who had lived on my credit. Vivienne lost her luxury apartment 6 weeks later. She moved into a small studio near a dental office where she eventually accepted an entry-level job, a far cry from the lifestyle creator image she had curated at my expense. She published her correction, which received far fewer views than her original lies, proving that the world prefers a scandalous lie to a quiet truth. I didn't immediately forgive them. I realized that acknowledgement is not repair. It is only the first tool needed to begin the process. I skipped the next family gathering, choosing instead to take a short trip to the coast with my daughter. For the first time in my adult life, I realized that nobody was shouting my name or demanding a solution for their avoidance. The silence didn't feel like abandonment. It felt like oxygen. Nearly a year later, Vivienne sent me a private message. She didn't ask for money. She said she understood now that I wasn't trying to make her feel small. She had already felt small, and humiliating me was easier than admitting she needed help. I thanked her for the honesty, but didn't invite her back into my life. For the first time, our communication didn't require my surrender. My relationship with Damien remained non-existent. He continued to blame the handling of the application, rather than his own intent, proving that some people choose to live without accountability even when the truth is written in their own ink. I eventually accepted that I couldn't extract an apology from someone who didn't value my personhood. Standing on the balcony of my office today, I am no longer the Iron Lady who hides her emotions to protect a failing family. I am a woman who knows her worth isn't measured in the rescues she provides. My career, my credentials, and my peace are no longer up for negotiation. I have learned that a boundary is not a speech. It is a decision that remains after the crying begins. I am Sloane Sterling. I am not my family's emergency account, their borrowed signature, or their silent insurance policy. I am finally, dangerously, and beautifully free. Conclusion. The journey of Sloane Sterling teaches us that unconditional love does not mean unconditional access to your identity, your career, or your peace. We learn that people often call you cruel or unstable the moment your boundaries make their exploitation inconvenient. The sharpest lesson from this story is that saving someone from the consequences of their own actions only preserves the behavior that will eventually destroy both of you. Forgiveness does not require renewed access, and financial help without accountability is merely a form of harm that protects people from the experiences that might teach them to change. Ultimately, you cannot heal in the same place that keeps reopening the wound. You must stop trying to persuade your family that you are a good person and start proving that you are a protected one. When you stop providing solutions for the avoidance of others, they are forced to either collapse or change, and that is a bill that must finally be returned to its rightful owner. Your life should not be governed by an audience that prefers a convenient lie over a difficult truth. It should be built on a foundation of integrity that remains solid long after the laughter stops. Seeking justice is not about revenge. It is about reclaiming the right to exist as a person rather than a signature.